What is trauma? I'm Jonathan Watt with Atara Group International, and we hope you're enjoying our series on mental health. If you are, please press the like button and consider subscribing to our channel. Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that can have profound physical and emotional impact on us. It can be caused by a single event, such as a car accident, the death of a loved one, or a natural disaster, or repeated exposure to stressful or traumatic situations, such as domestic abuse, community violence, or even bullying. Traumatic events can alter our worldview and destroy our trust in the world, in other people, and even in ourselves. Trauma can alter the course of our lives and how we interact with our family, our friends, and even with our society. Contact with overwhelming traumatic events may even produce long-term generational effects of trauma. Trauma not only affects us socially and emotionally and physically, it also impacts us spiritually. Let's look at some examples from the Bible. Let's take some looks at David's traumatic life. David, of course, was the best known and most beloved king of ancient Israel. His Psalms have inspired believers who have dealt with their own trauma over many generations. David was called a man after God's own heart, and he often looked to Yahweh when he was faced with traumatic experiences. Some theological scholars have suggested that some of the Psalms which David wrote were a way of expressing his struggle with PTSD after facing numerous battles. You see, although David was one of the greatest warriors of his time, it still took its toll on him. He spent years in battle, and although he experienced many victories, David admits that his soul is in distress. And he expresses that he's filled with sorrow to such a degree it actually weakens his body. And he compares this feeling to a soul-crushing grief. We're first introduced to David in the books of Samuel. David was a shepherd and faced natural disasters and dangers from lions and bears that tried to devour his sheep. David became a warrior when he killed the Philistine giant Goliath. And after his initial battle, trauma seems to have begun to permeate David's life. He ended up fighting in many battles through his life, civil wars between Israel and Judah, external wars with the Philistines and the Amalekites, and David even endured prolonged and repeated traumatic events in his association with King Saul. Saul numerous times attempted to kill David through a variety of means. With all of these traumatic events, you would think David might be incapacitated with trauma, although David experienced PTSD symptoms indeed, yet he also demonstrates an amazing resilience and well-being. He utilized his God-given advisors, Ahithophel and Hushai, and worked in fellowship with these men, and he wrote the Psalms as surely as one of his coping mechanisms. So David used both writing and music as a way to communicate with God and express his feelings. He poured his heart out to God in the songs that he composed, and through the Psalms we can see patterns of additional coping skills which emerged with David. He did things like, praise and worship God. He asked God for help. He strived to make sure his work aligned with God's. Overall, it's very simple. David trusted God. Let's come on to Hagar. Hagar also had a traumatic life. She's a significant figure in the Bible. She's known for her gripping story and role in the lineage and household of Abraham. Her narrative also is filled with trauma, trials, resilience, and divine intervention, making her an undeniable personality to explore when looking at trauma in people in the Bible. So Hagar was taken from her Egyptian home to Sarah's household in Canaan. She was uprooted from her social support system. her identity became distorted. She lost her home and her family of origin. The initial move from Egypt into Sarah's household would have been enough to cause Hagar physical and psychological distress, but her distress was compounded by her social standing as Sarah's slave. Her new role left her powerless and without any control over her own life. Now, this leads us to examine a second and even more obvious disruption to Hagar's identity. So you know the story. She was forced into involuntary surrogacy. She was discovered, when discovered she was pregnant, Hagar assumed a new identity. She now had a greater position of power. She was to become the mother of Abraham's first biological child. Her pregnancy represents a transition from a position of powerlessness to a future which holds some purpose and meaning with an increased social standing. So with so much previously stripped from her, it's not surprising, Hagar developed an arrogance in her newfound identity. She despised and blamed Sarah for her losses and her abuse, and Hagar transitions from being victim to victimizer. She becomes contemptuous of Sarah, taunting her about her infertility. Hagar's newfound position, however, was short-lived, and roles once again became reversed as she became the victim of further abuse from Abraham's family. Hagar, despite lacking the necessities for survival in the wilderness, fled her abuse out of desperation. So while Hagar wandered aimlessly, she met an angel, and the angel asked Hagar where she was going. Hagar only revealed that she was fleeing her mistress. Hagar's flight was characteristic of many trauma victims who give little thought to their escape plan. They often just want to go somewhere, but it leads to further victimization and subsequent incidents of trauma as a result. Well, the angel connected with Hagar on a personal level, called her by name, and this appears to be a simple act, but we think it had profound implications. See, thus far in the biblical text, Sarah and Abraham had dehumanized Hagar by referring to her only as a servant. The simple act of calling Hagar by name gave her a sense of value and worth, which she hadn't had, it seems, since she left Egypt. Hagar was no longer a nameless being, but an individual now with a name and an identity. Well, anyway, the angel instructed Hagar, interestingly, to return to Sarah and to the setting of her abuse. See, a trauma victim's most immediate need is for a place of safety and security and stability, yet Hagar had none of these things in the wilderness. And although she may have suffered more abuse in Abraham's house, she was even more vulnerable in the wilderness. And additionally, facing the place, the person, or the environment in which your trauma occurred is part of a plan for combating the trauma response of avoidance. Anyway, even more broadly, this signifies the importance of victims integrating back into their communities even after a traumatic experience. Well, the angel gave Hagar a divine promise and offered her hope. Like Abraham, Hagar was told she too would have many descendants. She was also told she would carry her pregnancy to full term, give birth to a son, and this was a promise of hope in the middle of an otherwise barren wilderness. See, Hagar was ultimately able to face her trauma through intervention and affirmation, and these were provided by God's own hand. Through this intervention, Hagar was able to reintegrate, to live in the present, and begin from a place of hope and growth as she moved on further. Hagar saw God in the wilderness and returned a changed woman. She did things like this. She allowed God's angel to intervene. She took direction from God, and she received the hope and affirmation that were offered to her. Let's turn next to Paul's traumatic life. The Apostle Paul was the first recorded missionary of the gospel of Jesus Christ, at least on an international level. He faced a multitude of obstacles during his missionary calling. While Paul was a missionary, he was overworked. He was imprisoned. He was chronically sleep deprived, and sometimes he was starved. He often lacked adequate clothing. He faced harsh physical elements and had near-death experiences from beatings, a stoning, robberies, and, that we know of, 2 shipwrecks. Paul received death threats equally from believers and non-believers alike, and often had to flee cities due to these threats. Now, Paul's missionary work was not the beginning of his traumatic experiences. You see, prior to his road to Damascus conversion, he was known as Saul, and during this period of his life, he actively persecuted believers in Jesus. He would incite, he would witness, apparently a number of stonings of the church's early leaders and members. And even though Saul instigated or helped with these traumatic events, he surely experienced secondary trauma from instigating such high levels of violence. You see, trauma is not limited to the victims, but it also reverberates back upon those who perpetrate and even witness such abuse. So Saul's conversion to Christianity was also in its own way traumatic. He experienced a blinding light which made him fall to the ground, and then the voice of God speaks to him. The event rendered him temporarily disabled. His vision was lost for 3 days, and when Saul became Paul, he experienced the same persecution which previously he had inflicted on others. You see, as if these traumas were not enough, Paul suffered additionally from chronic illnesses. These may not have been named specifically in the Bible, but some scholars speculate with reason that they may have included chronically poor vision, possibly epilepsy, or possibly depression, or something like these. Anyway, in spite of these overwhelming obstacles and these traumatic events, Paul also demonstrated an amazing resiliency. He utilized his faith in Christ to cope with his current life's events, and he also encouraged fellow church members to develop the same resiliency, drawing in part from their faith. He used his stories to instruct and coach others through their own traumatic journeys and through their own spiritual growth. So what do we take from Paul? Well, Paul trusted in God's strength, not his own. Paul believed that suffering built character and forced a person to grow spiritually. Paul communicated to God through prayer and encouraged others to pray as well. Paul followed God's calling on him. Let's turn next to Esther. Esther had a traumatic life as well. If Queen Esther were seeking mental health treatment today, we wonder if her narrative of her trauma might sound, something like this. I have prior history of mental health treatment. I didn't have it. It was there, but I didn't get to it. I was young when the Hebrews were exiled from Babylonia during the war. My parents died. I was adopted by my uncle Mordecai. We moved to Persia. I don't know if I remember the exact timeline. It was all sort of a jumble of events for me. I just remember that it seemed as if one thing after another was happening. Once we got to Persia, I felt like things settled down a little bit, but then King Xerxes gathered up all the young, attractive women to prepare them to try out as his new queen. You see, Mordecai didn't want me to go by my Hebrew name. He thought something might happen to me, so I started going by Esther. At first, it was hard. People would call to me, and I wouldn't answer because Esther wasn't my name. It was like I was two different people. When I was gathered to Xerxes' harem, I was prepped for months. I was taught how to act, what to say, what to do. Frankly, I was terrified and extremely anxious. I never imagined that Xerxes would actually choose me as his next queen. I really thought I would end up being forced to sleep with him for one night and then he would move on to the next woman, just as he had done for a very long time. Instead, he decided to marry me. I didn't know if I was relieved or upset. Then everything happened with Haman. He had his plot to kill Jews. He hated us. Mordecai told me I had to stop him by seeing the king. I was so scared. You see, nobody approaches the king without being asked first. That man kills people for less. Look at how he treated the last queen for disobeying him. So I fasted for 3 days, gathered my courage. I managed to stop him. He was killed along with all the others that wanted to kill my people. I was able to see Haman off to the side. Now that everything was calm, you might think I'd be fine, but I'm having nightmares many times a week. I have these thoughts of death. It's been around me and I can't get them out of my head. I don't want to see anyone. I haven't visited with Hagar or Mordecai in months, and now I have the annual Feast of Purim coming up. I always plan the festival. I'm usually excited about it, but this year I'm dreading all of the planning, the activities, the memories of that time. I should be joyful and grateful we survived, but sometimes I just feel numb. These are common PTSD symptoms which Esther might have experienced. They include things like anxiety, nervousness, and feeling overwhelmed. There are repeated and vivid memories of a traumatic event. One wants to withdraw from others. One has sometimes an inability to recall key details of the trauma. There's sleep disturbance. There's sometimes traumatic nightmares, and avoiding trauma-related thoughts and feelings and or objects, people, or places associated with the trauma. That's sometimes what one just wants to do out of desperation. One has distorted beliefs about oneself and the world, and sometimes people just describe it overall as emotional numbing. Well, what are our takeaways from these different studies we've just done of people in the Old Testament? The trauma David, Hagar, Paul, and Esther encountered mirrors what people around the world go through today. Humans still face a multitude of traumatic events of both natural and human origin. In our encounters with the narratives of those who have undergone significant traumas, we often find that traumas cluster together. So when one person experiences trauma, others around them may as well. In this case, we don't have to look very far from the trauma of Hagar to find Sarah. When we examine David's trauma, we see Saul. When we view the trauma of Paul, we can see the people he persecuted and those who persecuted him. A large portion of Esther's trauma was experienced by all those who were Jewish, feared for their lives, and lived in exile. So the coping skills of these biblical figures can be examined in light of today's coping and PTSD research, which can guide us and help us manage our own trauma. But keep in mind, it's difficult to work through all these symptoms. And painful feelings of trauma on your own, they can be hard to deal with. Sometimes recovering from trauma takes support from a trained professional. Your friends and your family and church can be a wonderful part of the healing process, though it's not the same as going to someone who is trained in trauma recovery. So at Atara Group International, we are trained in specific interventions which can stabilize trauma symptoms and help you process the events in your life which were so painful. Our goal is to help you recover and to experience post-traumatic growth. Now, if you believe that you need help coping with past trauma, visit our website and look at the profiles of our coaches and schedule a 15-minute free consultation with us. Now, if you are right now experiencing a mental health crisis such as suicidal thoughts, a severe distress, or an acute mental health problem, it is essential that you seek immediate guidance from a qualified mental health professional or from emergency services. These services are free and they're confidential. Feel free to call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can call 988 or you can call 1-800-273-TALK. And if you prefer or actually need to text in an emergency, text HOME to the number 741-741 from anywhere in the United States, 24/7. People are there to help you.